Well, hello, welcome back to Panorama Online. Just to recap as we begin movement number 9, which we refer to as the return from exile. Let's recap how we got here. If you remember, the nation of Israel has been called by God. This takes us all the way back to movement 3 with our Exodus event, our Sinai event, and our Tabernacle event. They've been set apart as a kingdom of priests to take the blessing of God out into the nations. And they have their high water mark with Joshua. As they make their way into the promised land, they go into the land, and Joshua finishes this subduing or conquering of the land by saying, "Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." We're going to serve Yahweh. And it's this choice that the nation of Israel had before them. Trust Yahweh and things will go well for you. Or do not trust Yahweh, do not obey Yahweh, and then things will go poorly for you. And one of those things that God had said was, I will come in. If you don't obey me, if you don't love me, if you don't follow me, then I will come in and remove you from your land. That'll be a sign that you are being judged by me and disciplined by me, because you have to trust me, you have to be faithful to me. And as the nation of Israel's story unfolds, first in the period of the Judges, which we call the downward spiral or the apostasy, and then in the kingship united and the kingship divided, we're going to see that in that divided kingdom of Israel, we have essentially just a disaster of idolatry. As the nation of Israel splits into Israel in the north and Judah in the south, all the kings of Israel worship and serve idols, and in 722 they will be taken into Assyrian captivity. And in the southern kingdom, which we call the kingdom of the Judeans or Judah, those two tribes will have mostly bad leadership as well that will lead them into idolatry. And beginning in 605, again in 597, and then the big one, the Mac Daddy of all of the exiles, comes in 586 BC as the Babylonians, who by the way had conquered the Assyrian Empire, they come in and they carry away the Judeans, the kingdom called Judah, into exile. This is where we find ourselves as we turn now to the return. What is it like to live in exile? And then how is God going to be faithful to His promise? Remember the promise He made all the way back in Genesis chapter 12 to provide land and a nation, descendants, and to bless the whole world through this people called Israel. How can God be faithful to that promise? And that's what we're going to turn to now as we look at session 9, the return from exile. And as we look at the return from exile, we've covered some kind of getting our story back on track. We've kind of reviewed where we're at, and you can see that review on page 154. This is from whence we've came. Look how far we've made it thus far. There's all the movements, and there are the helpful kind of hints to get you to remember what's going on in the movements. And on page 155, we have our addition to the timeline for this particular movement. Now, here's where we're at. Return from exile. So session number 9 of the Panorama timeline is what we call return. And the return is going to have some people and then some nations. That's what you're going to be memorizing for this section. It's really, the way I want you to remember it is this: 3 builders and 3 prophets, and then what we're going to have is 4 nations. 3 builders, 3 prophets, and 4 nations. And so the 3 builders are these: Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Those are the 3 builders. And if you can see on page 155, Zerubbabel will, essentially he'll be rebuilding the temple. Ezra will be helping to rebuild the people constituted around obedience to God and the Torah. And then Nehemiah will help get the city back on track in rebuilding the wall. Now, the 3 prophets, these are what we call the post-exile, post-exilic prophets, meaning they take place after the exile. And here's these 3. It's Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, what I want you to do on page 155, if you're writing in your notebook, is I want you to circle Haggai and Zechariah and draw an arrow to Zerubbabel. Those 2 are contemporaries with Zerubbabel, and the date for that's going to be 538 to 515 BC. Okay, so in this first wave of return from exile is going to be Zerubbabel and 2 prophets, Haggai and Malachi, or Haggai and Zechariah. The next two, so Ezra and Nehemiah, they're going to be contemporary with Malachi. So you can take the where it says Malachi on page 155 and draw an arrow to Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah and Malachi are going to be contemporaries of each other. And their stories all going to take place in the mid 400s BC. So about 100 years after Zerubbabel and Haggai and Zechariah, we're going to have Malachi and Ezra and Nehemiah. So that's kind of how the story unfolds. So 3 builders, 3 prophets. Zerubbabel, Haggai, and Zechariah are all contemporaries in about the late 500s BC. And then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi are going to be the mid 400s BC. Now what you have to remember is the people of Israel will not have any national sovereignty during this period. We're going to see a brief period, but even that is kind of hard to it's hard to compare with what we saw before during the kingship united or even the kingship divided. So during this time, this is what we're going to have you try to remember in the Panorama timeline. During this time, there are other nations who essentially are batting the people of Israel around almost like a ping pong ball on a ping pong table. They don't have their freedom. They don't have their sovereignty. They find themselves under foreign domination and rule. And these time periods are going to be really important when we look at the book of Daniel here in our return section in just a moment. And this is going to be very key background material for our New Testament and what Jesus is doing, okay? So it's really, really important. The first nation is called the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire essentially is going to have about a 200-year run from about 540 when Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon in 539, and they're going to have a run of domination in this part of the world all the way up till Alexander the Great, which would be the leader of the Greek Empire. That's going to be in the 330s. And the Greeks are going to have a run, especially over the people called Israel in the land until the mid 2nd century BC. So in 168, this is the background, by the way, for our story of Hanukkah, as Jews celebrate every year. The background of that story for Hanukkah is what we find in the Maccabean revolt in 168 BC. And for a brief period in the land of Israel, they're going to have a Hebrew independence led by what's called the Hasmonean dynasty. But then they're going to get conquered by Rome. So four, we might call them nations that rule and reign over the land of Israel. Persia, Greece, brief period of independence, and then Rome. And that Roman Empire will be the backsetting, the backstory for so much of what's going to take place for the New Testament and what Jesus is doing. So there's the timeline, there's the movements, and we'll dive into the feel of what this exile would have been like as we continue in our study.